Today, we've got a very special guest on this programme. My dad, Dr Simon Peaple. As he talks to us about his latest book and his studies of the First World War. Hello, and thank you for coming on the programme. For the viewers at home, would you mind explaining who you are and, if you like, an outline of your latest book?
Thank you, and thank you for asking me. As always, very friends. My name is Simon Peaple, formerly Dr Simon Peaple. I've did a PhD in Great War Studies at Birmingham University and produced a study on the 46th North Midland Division, exploring the history of the British Army's development during the First World War. And my latest book is From Maubeuge to the Rhineland, which is a history of the 1st Division during the Great War. This is rather a contrast to the 46th Division. 46th Division was a territorial division originally raised for home defence and subsequently deployed to France, and was seen as a very unfashionable second-rate division, which had several bad days and then did brilliantly well at the Hindenburg Line. So that was seen as sort of exemplifying part of the learning curve. And the 1st Division was sort of complete opposite in a way. It was the premier division of the British Army. It included a brigade of guards before the Guards Division was created, and therefore was prestigious, made up of pre-war regulars and reservists, and went through a very different period of time. So that's where that comes from.
So, given the traditional focus on the generals and commanders in the First World War, how would you argue their role has been over or possibly even underplayed?
I think the difficulty with the debate about the First World War is that when Alan Clark wrote Lions Led by Donkeys, he went too far in one sense, and sort of made it so that every soldier was, amazing hero, and every general was an idiot. And that's a gross oversimplification. And I think Alan Clark's choice of quote from Ludendorff is problematic, in that you should really look at your source. Ludendorff wanted to explain Germany's defeat in ways other than what really happened, and so he emphasised something that he thought the British would pick up on, and they did, and so the sort of British officer class were pilloried. That doesn't mean that I agree that all of them were in fact great thinkers or original operatives. I'm seen as on the radical wing. I still find the official sort of consensus, comfortable consensus as it's been called, around Haig as really a decent chap who did his best, and couldn't have done any better as again an oversimplification. It's correct to say that the generals were better than Clark portrayed, but it's also true that there was a huge amount of indifference to the cost of what they were doing, not in the sense that they didn't visit hospitals and things like that, but just the way in which they prioritised their goals without great thought. And particularly in the book I deal with Operation Hush, which is an amphibious operation related to Passchendaele, and the Battle of Third Ypres, to use its official title, was intended to have a strategic overview created by freeing up the Channel ports and reducing the U-boat menace, and that was called Operation Hush, and that involved an amphibious landing on the Yser estuary. However, it was never really given the priority that it needed. It was always a reserve, and I feel Haig used it as a kind of blind on the cabinet. You know, don't worry, we're launching another offensive. It's going to be very like the other ones, but don't worry, because this time there's a big strategic picture. And what actually happened was that the operation at Messines Ridge, which was designed to be the preamble to Third Ypres, went very successfully. The Germans realised exactly what was going on, and Operation Standfest, which is German for beach party, was launched, which took out 1st Division's 2nd Brigade and completely prevented any amphibious operation. Despite that happening in July, and despite the operation being effectively cancelled in the first half of August, the cabinet were never informed, and therefore they blundered on, thinking that the operations for Ypres were going to have a bigger strategic success than they were ever really likely to. So yes, I think the generals' debate has been well worn. We're nearer the middle than the edges of either side's argument, but you only have to look at the 3rd phase of Ypres to see that it really was completely pointless to drive for Passchendaele. Thank you.
And speaking of that Ludendorff quote, that, you know, the one about the lions led by donkeys, which is often repeated in First World War narratives, how far would you say your research supports or challenges this assertion?
Well, I think my research shows that there were a large number of officers, senior officers included, who thought very hard about what was going on, and therefore they were not the donkeys that were portrayed. However, I still feel that there was a very strong element of the British senior officer class maintaining a view of the world that was not really adjusting to what was going on ahead of them, so much as trying to fit their pre-war paradigms into what was going on. So the constant talk about the wearing out fight took very little account of the fact that if you're wearing the enemy out, you'll be wearing yourself out. So I think there is real issues about that, and you know, there are some who sort of argue that, you know, Haig was right, that the British Army was wearing the Germans out, and you've only got to see 1918 to prove that. I think the difficulty I have with that argument is that he's appointed in 1915, he says the Germans are about to collapse in 1915, 16, 17 and 18, and it's like a sort of, you know, if you keep predicting that it'll rain, one day it will, and then you say, look, I told you it was going to rain. So I think there is still a debate to be had, but I think what my research and research of other people in this area has shown is that below the most senior level, there was real hard work going on to think, right, what did we get right last time? What did we not get right last time? What can we do to adapt? And you see right from 1915 onwards, in fact, some changes coming in, the gradual adoption of the creeping barrage, the realisation, for example, that if you do everything at the same time, then you give yourself away. So the decision to have no barrage and a surprise attack in the middle of the Somme campaign is a demonstration of people beginning to think, hang on a minute, we need to do this differently. But the other thing which comes out, I feel, more and more, is that if you look at the men who were there when the British Army won in 1918, they are, by definition, largely not the pre-war regulars, who rarely survive that long. There will be a few, but you know, relatively speaking, they're not there. They're not even the mostly the Kitchener volunteers. They're the conscripts. So in theory, they're the ones that you would have seen as least likely to be, the best. And you have to recognise that those men have got a bit of learning, or the learning through their training is more realistic. They're being asked to do things which are more realistic because, for example, you're not doing what you did in 1916. You're not saying, right, attack, then push through to the second line, then push through on, which just bleeds units of men and destroys their momentum. By 1918, you're leapfrogging. You're sending a unit forward to take the first line, which is then backed up by another unit which seizes a second objective, and a further unit that seizes the third objective. So you're giving yourself momentum. The men who go into one piece of action know that when they've done their job, they've done their job. And that allows the British Army to achieve great things. But inherent in that, absolutely key to victory, is the industrial mobilisation of Britain. In my history of the 1st Division, we look at the beginnings of trench warfare on the Aisne in 1914. The Germans can outgun the British as they can't seize the Chemin des Dames. Therefore, they have to dig trenches. Therefore, both sides become fixed. And so-called race to the sea follows, and similar pattern is followed. But the key, the absolute key, is that by 1918, Britain has mobilised industrially. So, for example, a unit in 1914 would go to war 1,029 strong with its 30 officers, its full complement of men, would be 1,000 men for a battalion. The average battalion in 1918 is probably averaging 650 to 700 men, of whom probably not more than 600 are actually trench ready, trench fit at any one time, because of people on courses, wounded returning, the usual treadmill of casualties. But those 600 men have no longer got just 2 machine guns. So the 1,000 men of 1914 have 2 machine guns. The 600 men of 1918 have 32 machine guns. And they're Lewis guns which can be carried into action more flexibly. So that alone means that the stopping power of a British soldier or infantry unit has changed, because it can actually offset its own loss of numbers by the sheer firepower that it brings. Secondly, you look at the Diamond Formation in 1918, everybody remembers the documentaries of the Somme and the way the lines of men going forward. I had the privilege of meeting a man who was on the first day of the Somme with the Staffords. He was a machine gunner, and he was in the 4th wave, and they didn't get anywhere very much because the first waves were mown down. But if you look at 1918, you have the Diamond Formation, you have platoons going forward, led by a section of riflemen who will get pinned down in the same way. Machine gun, unsuppressed machine gun, they'll hit the ground. But as soon as that happens, what happens next? The section with the rifle grenadiers moves to the flank. The section with machine guns, the Lewis guns, moves to the flank, either side. One suppresses the machine gun post's fire while the other gets closer. Or the rifleman can get closer because the machine gun's not able to fire effectively, and therefore they can storm the position. Or the rifle grenadier gets the right grenade in the right place and takes out the gun crew. Either way, that keeps momentum going. And where was the commander? Not at the back in the sense of many yards behind, but at the back of the Diamond, able to take in what is going on, devolved authority to that platoon commander. People were briefed down to platoon level and below so that people knew what they had to do. That makes a huge difference. But if you look then at what has gone on to make that attack possible, in 1916 at the Somme, there's all the stories everybody's seen of the the Germans were being shelled and in awful conditions for those men with these big shells landing on them. But maybe a third of those often US manufactured, rushed manufactured shells did not explode. The wire cutting was inadequate. By 1918, a German sitting in that similar position at the Hindenburg Line, during the Battle of Amiens, at various points, they will first of all have taken a relatively short but a very intense heavy artillery battering, 60-pounder guns, delivering shells targeted based on photographs, based on aerial observation, based on, critically as well, 3 weather reports a day. If you're firing a shell 5 miles, which at maximum some of them would be doing for the heavier guns, you need to know what the barometric pressure is, because that will determine how far the shell will go with a set amount of explosive on a set day. So you have to vary it. The artillery by that point had got individual calibration of the guns in a battery. So the degree of wear in a barrel would be obvious, would have been measured. They would know this gun fires slightly over, so put slightly less charge. This gun is new, therefore make adjustments accordingly. Huge amount of effort goes in. So that 60-gun barrage, 60-pounder gun barrage, is then followed by the field gun barrage. So if you're a German, you've had this enormous crunching shell fire. Then you get the 18-pounder guns sweeping ahead of the infantry. And you might think, well, that's where it goes wrong in 1916. In 1916, the Germans race to their dugout posts, out of their dugouts, and get there largely before the British can cross no man's land. 1918, when you're that German thinking, right, this must be it now, what happens? There's a heavy machine gun barrage. The heavy machine guns have been set up to barrage your lines. So as those British troops get nearer, behind the curtain of shell fire, there's a point at which that curtain of shell fire has got to pass over you in order for the infantry to get forward. But you as a German cannot get out onto your parapet because there is machine gun fire landing on your positions as an extra curtain in front of the advancing infantry. Now that level of mechanisation of warfare is only possible through the industrial mobilisation. The women and the men, where appropriate into certain crafts and trades, who produced all this firepower, were absolutely vital to that outcome. They were the ones who were making it possible, because if you couldn't have this huge quantity of material available, then it wouldn't work. I mean, if you look at 1916 on the Somme, it's famous that 1 million shells were fired the week before. They'd had to gather all the shells, make sure they had the best possible supply ready for those guns, and it really stretched it when they had to do the 2 extra days. In 1918, at the Battle of Amiens, on the 8th of August, they fired over 1 million shells. On the 29th of September, when it came to the Battle of the Hindenburg Line, they were able to deliver another 1 million shells. So 6 weeks apart, 2 major actions, and you've got the firepower of the Somme twice. That shows you the level of mobilisation and the huge battle that went on between the logistics, bringing the Americans over, had to be secondary to bringing in the steel, the coal and the other things. And that's one reason why the build-up is slower than people thought it would be. It's because actually the ships were needed to bring in the raw materials to make the guns, to make the shells, because Britain was building a lot of the stuff that the French couldn't build because they'd lost their coal mines, lost their steelworks. So that's absolutely critical to victory in the end. And I think that shows you the tactics, the material involvement, and that breaks the German army, which itself has already been bled for 4 years, and one shouldn't underestimate that.
So, well, as I say, so in terms of innovations and such, one of the things that people often talk about is the idea that the tank was what broke the deadlock, or the aircraft. How would you say? How would you argue about whether whether it was the tank, things like tanks and aircraft that broke the deadlock of the First World War, or whether you feel it was more like the tactics to use them, or perhaps something independent of those entirely?
Well, I think if you look at the tactics by 1918, you can see a huge development in the use of other forms of warfare that weren't available in 1914. I've already touched on some of the basic material developments. The tank is very important in the sense that it forms a part of the battering ram, and it does make a big difference. But it's really important to remember that it was introduced quite naturally in 1916, and like all of the developments in the First World War, each side then draws conclusions and adopts particular approaches. The Germans decided, ironically, when you think of what happened in World War II, but they decided not really to develop their own tanks very much. They used a few captured British tanks, and they used a few of their own, but they concentrated on anti-tank measures. And it's really important to remember that the tank was a large square object. Yes, it wasn't a square, but it was a large square in the gun sights of a lot of German field guns. And it could only move over the battlefield at about a mile an hour. Top speed 4 miles an hour was not going to be achieved on a battlefield. And so it would advance effectively a big target. And if an artillery battery held its nerve, they could take it out. Added to which, they were incredibly hard to work in. I mean, less than half of the tanks used at the Battle of Amiens in 1918, which was one of its big success days, couldn't be used the following day, partly because of the damage received, but also because the tank crews themselves were exhausted. If you think you were working in what in old-fashioned terms was 104, 105 degrees, so the sort of weather that people in the 1970s sat on the beach and said this is incredibly hot, men were working inside those tanks. There were bits of metal from armoured piercing bullets, so there would be metal from the armour piercing bullets hitting the outside of the tank, causing bits of the inside of the tank to break off and zoom around, which made it particularly unpleasant, likely to be wounded and possibly killed just by that. You had the exhaust fumes, which weren't properly taken through because you had the exhaust from the gun, if nothing else. So you imagine working in that hot environment, dangerous environments with fumes, and doing that for a day was quite enough to wipe out half the crews. Would need a day to detox, a bit like a diver who's come up from the deep. So there was a huge amount of losses, or at least wounded during and resting during the campaign. So the tank couldn't on its own solve the problem, and nor could the aircraft. But the aircraft by the end was being much better used. There were various points in the First World War where the Germans held the technological advantage. They were the ones that introduced the synchronised machine guns that could fire through the propellers and so on. So at different stages they held the advantage. But by 1918 the Allied air forces were stronger. And the key then was how those aircraft were used. And what's fascinating is to see how they were used so effectively, but always in effect, to make it possible for the infantry to seize the ground that was ahead of them. So yes, people would be familiar with aircraft used for spotting, aircraft used for general reconnaissance. But importantly, we see at Beaumont Hamel in early 1918, the first time where aircraft are used for a resupply. They brought ammunition up to the Australians who were fighting hard. But later in the 1918, we see them doing what would be called interdictory activity. So key to any of the First World War battles was how fast the reinforcements could reach the front line once it was attacked. So in 1915, it was nearly always possible for the defender to get more reinforcements in before the attacker could get through. So you might break in to the line, but they could always cover behind. And the same happened in 16, 17 largely, although there were exceptions. But mostly that was the case. I mean, even the Canadians at Vimy Ridge were brought to a halt by the fact that the Germans closed up behind the breach. So in 1918, what's the aircraft doing? Well, one of the key things they're doing is machine gunning the normal ways forward that the Germans would use. So everybody would try and monitor, well, you know, how do they bring troops up? And you look at the maps that have been drawn up by the aircraft reconnaissance and you can see there's a route. So you machine gun that route. Now, locally it was done by machine guns on the ground. Heavy machine guns would be deployed to machine gun the rear areas. But if you're going to bring your troops forward, you've probably got to hold them back a little bit because you don't know exactly where it's going to come. The attack's going to come. So the local reserves may well be stopped by interdictory fire or delayed by interdictory fire from machine guns. But the aircraft were used to pick up, if you like, the divisional and corps reserves as they came forward, either by being able to threaten to machine gun their road, and therefore they're all having to take cover, which means it takes 2, 3, 4, 5 hours extra to get to the battlefield, which can be critical and is often critical. Or we see them bombing railway stations, which obviously means that if you bomb the railway station, then the line can't operate, so the reserve trains that are due to bring extra troops into the area can't get in, and therefore you destroy. And even if you make the trains late, you don't have to destroy the whole thing. You just make them late, delay them, and those few hours are absolutely critical, because without those reserves coming forward, you can achieve the gain that you've made and consolidate. And that fits with one of the key points about the latter end of the war, the so-called bite and hold. Set a reasonable objective, do it, take it. And as the historian Peter Simpkins said some years ago, by 1918 it was pretty much possible to say, we will capture X position on these lines, and they had a methodology to do it. And one of that methodology was using aircraft, using tanks. But key, I think, in many ways, is that all perspective that you've got, where you've brought all those things together. There isn't one weapon that wins the war. And it's easy in a way to say, oh, aircraft won the war or tanks won the war because they weren't there at the beginning. But they didn't win the war in 1916. They didn't win the war in 1917. So you have to put it in the context of what was being done in 1918. And that's where they fit.
So thanks. And granted, we've mentioned the Australians in the last bit as well, but one thing that we might remember in 1914 when the European powers went to war was that they brought their empires with them. Do you feel that the role of to what people at the time might have referred to as small nations and their peoples have been underplayed in discussions of the First World War? And if so, what areas of research into, for example, Irish or Indian contributions do you think should be pursued?
I think the difficulty for a lot of historians with regard to this is that it's quite hard to get round some of the other issues that have been created since the war. So, for example, I remember Peter Simpkins saying that he was going to a conference in Australia, and I said to him, so what messages are you going to take, or have you got any particular key points? And he said, well, one point that's not going to be popular is that I've got to tell them they didn't win the war. And it caused great hilarity in the group of scholars at the meeting, because it was the idea of getting to Melbourne or somewhere and saying the Australians didn't win. But it is important. But I think the hard bit is almost the reverse. So if you go round the Indian memorials around the southern end of the sector down to the La Bassée Canal, one of the problems is they're in a very poor state of repair. And I think what's happened, and it's happened with the Irish and it's happened with perhaps less so with the White Dominions, was that they get entangled in the whole nationalist narrative. So if you look at the Indian situation, they were used on the Western Front at a time when the main British developments, the Kitchener battalions and so on, weren't available, and therefore they kind of filled a gap, and then they got taken away and went off to fight bravely elsewhere, and they have never really perhaps had the recognition in India, because what happened afterwards? Well, there was a great struggle for independence, and do you celebrate all the people who fought and died for the British at a time when you're trying to say that the British should go? And I mean, in Ireland, it's even more complicated than that, because half of them wanted them to go and half, a fraction of them didn't want them to go. But the key there is, there's a song about the Dublin Rising, about the men who went to the First World War. Oh, had they died by Pearse's side? So the lens of reflection has been through what happened afterwards. So if you're Canadian, if you're Australian, if you're New Zealand, then yes, you get Dominion status and you eventually get independence, and it's all very peaceful, and to a degree the same in South Africa, and therefore you can celebrate, that the triumph on Vimy Ridge demonstrates Canada becoming a nation, and the Australians sort of celebrate Anzac Day. It's this day when Australia took its status as a nation to another step forward. But if you're the Indian government, do you celebrate those men who died for the British in the First World War? If you're the Irish government, there's been this ambiguity for a long time about the men who fought for the British. And there's a book to be written about how they were let down by the promises made in 1914 and not kept. But there is that issue, I think, that what has happened is people have got to discuss it in the context of what happened next. And it's interesting that in Ireland there's now beginning to be a discussion of those who went in 1914, who fought in the First World War, as being more like, doing your ancestor research, and it's not as perhaps it's not as difficult to talk about your ancestors who fought on that side as opposed to the ones who were at home and took part in the War of Independence. So it's that juggling act. I mean, completely complicated the other way. When you look at Northern Ireland, because the 6 counties that remained as part of the United Kingdom after the war, of course, supercharge their role to the point where if you go to Ypres at the anniversary, or to the Menin Gate, on the anniversary of the Somme, you'll see the Ulster Defence Regiment parading its flag or its affiliates. And they weren't there. They were formed in the 1970s as a result of the Troubles. but it's like, no, this is our heritage, we must have the flag, you know. And in one sense, it's quite true that most of their ancestors would have served in the British Army. But I always remember going to Northern Ireland during the Troubles and being with a member of the Unionist community, and we got past the War Memorial, and he said to me, "We didn't need conscription." And of course, that's not actually true. They didn't dare impose conscription, and that's why there was no conscription. But it's like, you know, that's been turned into, we didn't need to have it because we were going to fight for our country anyway, and it's just not historically correct. So it's quite interesting how the lens has been distorted by what happened subsequently. I think that's key to understanding it. Whether there should be more research, I think it would be interesting to see more research. Some of the historians, British historians, have written more about the Indians and their place at Maubeuge Ridge. They're mentioned in Maubeuge to the Rhineland as part of the Maubeuge Ridge attack. So, you know, they are getting recognition. What they're probably not getting recognition is at home, which is the interesting one. The whole Chinese labour battalion issue clearly is very complicated and certainly wouldn't fit with any Chinese nationalist agenda. Would probably fit quite well into an anti-imperialist one. The Portuguese, for example, had a pretty torrid time, and again it goes back to, well, why were we there in the first place? One group in Portugal wanted them involved, one didn't. So, you know, these factions of politics, and then, you know, it gets into the Salazar regime. So it doesn't fit quite with the image of the country thereafter. So again, they didn't get written about, and frankly didn't perform terribly well when they were in battle. So, you know, there isn't a great story to tell of their heroic deeds that's gone unmentioned. So that's an example again. And then if you move away from the Western Front and you look at the Czechs on the Russian front and so on, they're now getting a bit more recognition. But then it's okay, isn't it? There's now a Czech Republic, therefore they can celebrate Czech soldiers fighting for neither Russia nor the Germans. It's okay, it's comfortable stuff. But while there wasn't a Czech nation, they weren't as celebrated or mentioned. I mean, it certainly wasn't going to be mentioned in the Soviet Union that, you know, the Czech soldiers decided they didn't like the Russian Revolution and fought against it. So, yeah, politics, I think, is driving what's going on in terms of the research around nations.
And just jumping away to a slightly different topic, but when it was conducting your research into the First World War, how important and in what ways do you consider it to study ordinary soldiers, things like their diaries, stock receipts, equipment, so on and so on?
Well, what I took great pleasure from in the description of the book from the editor was that it, if I may quote here, it said it challenges the comfortable consensus amongst some university academics whilst being based on the most thorough research of primary and published sources. And I think the key to the primary sources are the war diaries. But I think key to the book is that it doesn't just deal with battles. Frankly, more books sell about days of battle, people writing whole books about one day. In fact, I recently came across one that effectively writes a book about not just one day, but effectively the 4 unrecorded hours of one day, although it does cover the day itself. But that sort of thing is great if you want just to have a comfortable read about soldiers and people winning Victoria Crosses and, you know, being brilliant sort of examples of courage in face of complete adversity. But I think the First World War is very importantly needs to be understood as a multi-layered situation. So, for example, in the book, I've tried very hard not just to be driven by the diary, which records the loss of an officer or a particular individual, who usually is going to be remembered partly because the commanding officer knows them. So a letter will go to the family from them because they knew them personally. You know, you might get a letter from a platoon officer to somebody's family saying that Private X has died and he was a great chap. He's so sorry, and that's fine and genuine, and no, nothing wrong with it. But the longer letters, the more detailed letters are written about people they know. It's like anything else. And so I've tried to then say, well, X dies, and this is what was said about them, and so on, because we do have that record. But what I've tried to do is then say, but on the same day, amongst the same people, you know, died as so-and-so, who leaves a widow in Stepney, and, you know, it is a multi-level war. And one of the things that comes out is that, you know, the huge privations faced by everybody, and you can see why the men who served would always have great respect for officers up to the level of lieutenant colonel, because they were in the trenches with you. You know, yes, the lieutenant colonel might not be out on a raiding group, but, you know, nonetheless, they were there with you. When the shells came down, they could get hit just as easily as you. And so you had that shared privation. And I've tried to pick out things. You know, for example, the 1st Division introduced a new system for getting boots checked before they're reissued to the men. You know, and you think, well, yeah, it's really very important. And they're simple things. But just trying to get that sense in this book of the days spent not doing the glorious stuff. You know, there wasn't much glory to be had in trying to refill a trench that had filled with mud for the 3rd time in a week and a half in December 1916. But it was a real part of the experience of the First World War. You know, men did spend time doing other things. I mean, there's one parade for General Joffre which I've put some detail on, because it sort of exemplified that there were days when, you know, men were lined up and told to cheer the general when he went by in his car, even to the point where they were told to gather in groups of up to 30 under an officer, looking as though they were doing something else, but then turn and cheer. You know, it's just to bring out, if you like, that the day was not always a battle day. If it had been, there'd have been nobody left well before 1918. And the men who came back, I think it also helps you to understand their attitude. You know, my own grandfather came back from the trenches. He was a RASC driver who'd been declared unfit to serve in 1915, but by 1916 was, you know, they were taking lower standards of fitness. And he came back and never really wanted much to talk about it. And you could see why when you read something like this, which is an overall account. You know, there might be only 2 men killed or wounded that particular day, you know, or in a week in a particular trench section. But it brought home what he and so many others talked about, being lucky to be alive. You know, because someone else was in that trench 10 yards further down and caught a mortar bomb that landed, and you just happened to not be in that particular place at that particular time. He drove ammunition wagons through Hellfire Corner. There's a 1 ton of small arms ammunition or other stuff on the back of your wagon. You know, if the shell hits you, you ain't got to be worried about being wounded, because you won't be. You'll be on the gate to the missing, because they won't be able to find you. So some get killed, some don't. But the nerve and the bravery of those individuals going forward in the knowledge that that could be what happens is the same. And that's why I think it's really important that the ordinary soldiers life and death is recorded, not in the sense of that we don't know that, you know, thousands more people died who had the rank of private than others. The highest proportionate level of casualties was second lieutenant, and that was the worst ratio. About 1 in 8 would be killed. But the point is that, and obviously some of them will then survive and get promoted and get killed, but you understand what I'm driving at. The number of privates killed is easily the largest single group. But the key to understanding what they went through and what they came home with as memories and understanding is to see that, yes, there might have been 12, 14 hours of absolute tension as they went forward on the Maubeuge Ridge, the Luz, the Somme, Passchendaele, whatever. Yes, there were those days. But what about those months and weeks in between when they faced, you know, the daily, mind-wearing conditions that were on the Western Front, where you got up cold, you maybe got fed. I mean, the British Army was relatively well fed and supplied compared with others, but you know, at the end of the day, you were cold, you were wet, you were tired. And there was a point at which, in December 1916, one of the officers recorded in the diary, you know, the men are struggling because they're tired, they can't sleep properly because it's so cold, and then they get up again to try and do another load of work. And they reduce the trench time, the rotation time for the first line units in the front line, because they knew they couldn't do that. They couldn't do the usual week in, week out rotation. They reduced it to 3 days because it gave the men some chance to recuperate before doing another 3 days in the worst of the conditions. So it just emphasises that real life, the day-to-day life of the British soldier, rather than focusing just on the days when they went into action in an overt way.
Well, speaking of nations and people and all this, because some have said about Britain that the England that was died at the Somme, and there are certain allusions to this made in Australia and New Zealand about Gallipoli, and Canada for Passchendaele and Vimy Ridge, as we mentioned earlier. How far would you say the First World War contributed and directed the understanding of nationhood in the years that followed?
Well, I think with the Canadians, you mentioned the Canadians at Passchendaele. The Canadians were told by Haig that he needed them to do this job, and they would understand why, but it was a dirty job that he was asking them to do. And I think never a truer word was said in one sense, because it was a completely unnecessary attack. Nothing was achieved by getting to Passchendaele that wouldn't have been consolidated by not getting there. And that was why it had to be abandoned in 1918. So that perception of being sacrificed is true. I think it's affected a lot of people's perceptions thereafter. But I think the really key understanding alludes back to the point that Vera Britton's book was about this lost generation. There was a sense that, you know, I can remember being brought up, being told about the Oxbridge scholars who were of Horace and great sort of academic potential who died at Somme. You know, it was always X, Y, Z. And there was a sense in Britain before the First World War that certainly some of the middle class, if you like, started to limit family size because the costs of children had gone up relative to income, and therefore there was one son, and that one son may well have been lost on the battlefields of the First World War. So there was this narrative of a lost generation. But I think that is a really soft cop-out for the decline of Britain after the First World War. If you look at the hard truth economically, by 1914, German coal production and steel production were outpacing Britain's. Certainly in coal, they were outpacing it per shift. Britain was not investing in new mines, it was investing only in keeping digging coal out of the mines that were already there. It was not achieving the economic growth. There's a big debate amongst economic historians about what they call the third generation problem. That in British industry you had these big Victorian entrepreneurs who would build the business up and do, you know, the great sort of, studied all night, worked all day, individuals who their whiskered faces on plaques and pictures who made British industry. And then the next generation sort of are brought up in the firm, and the generation after that go to public school, and therefore the whole thing falls apart. This is called this 3-generation thesis. The reality is British industry was not increasing. It led the first industrial revolution. It did not lead the second industrial revolution in the 1890s. Germany was easily becoming the biggest, strongest economic power in Europe, and therefore the changes that came on Britain in the post-war years were not due to a lost generation. They were due to some fundamental economic changes which had gone on. The growth of the United States is clearly important. So those two things alone would have meant that Britain would have faced a very different situation. But absolutely fundamental is recognising that Britain chose to go to war in 1914, and as a result of that war owed 11 times as much money in 1918 as it did in 1914, and at a debt cost much greater than that because the interest rate on the debt from the war was higher than the pre-war. So what you've got is Britain effectively bankrupting itself to win World War One, or to be on the winning side of World War One. It wouldn't be fair to say it won it on its own. It played a very key role, but it didn't win it on its own. And so for the governing class of Britain to look back and say, oh, we lost this lost generation, was very convenient. But it didn't address the real issue, which is that they lost their way in the world for fundamental economic problems. Britain was not moving ahead technologically. It wasn't producing the top quality goods that it needed to produce. So, if you think about textiles, you've got the cotton revolution in Britain in the first industrial revolution. Britain's way ahead and introduces manufacturing of silk even, and begins to develop all kinds of things. So it's done really well. But when you look at the 1890s, the chemical industries, the glass industries, the high quality things that are the part that second are coming from elsewhere, and Britain is struggling. Now you can make a very strong argument that it kept free trade for too long, it became a dumping ground for other people's goods. It made, there are policy decisions you can talk about that, which you can work around. But the fundamental is Britain was economically going down in position. And you look at the war itself, you see the reduction in overseas assets. So assets that were held in the United States, for example, get liquidated. So the income from overseas investment drops as a result of the First World War, because at the end of it there's less overseas investment than there was before. And one should question, if you want, why were people busy investing in American facilities that would put British jobs on the line? Because they were chasing investment all the time, investment income. Look at Egypt. Egypt in the 1890s paying 15% on bonds, which would have got 2% at home, You know, the cotton manufacturing dividends were down at 1.5%. So, you know, there are huge problems economically for Britain in 1914. And when they go to war, those problems are exacerbated. So, for example, British shipping is obviously the largest in the world. British shipping then is also the largest amount that goes under the sea thanks to the U-boats. So, therefore, what happens at the end of the First World War? Britain's dominance of the carrying trade has diminished because there aren't as many British ships, and because there aren't as many British ships, other ships are taking that carrying trade. So the fees, the insurance fees, all of those things that stem from it, all those service items of income go as well. So yes, there was a tragedy of a lost generation of individuals, of course there were, but that's not why Britain goes into economic decline. And some of the post-war policies, my future research will not be looking more at this, some of the post-war policies, I mean the one that everybody knew at the time was wrong, was Britain decides to go back on the gold standard, and that means cutting expenditure at home, which hits the working class, the people who've just won the war. And then they decide to go back on the wrong level. So they go back at the pre-war level. So no recognition of what's happened as a result of the war. And what does that mean? Well, it means that all Britain's key industries are outpriced in the world markets. Coal is too expensive, so there's a drop in demand for coal. There's a drop in the demand for British ships because British ships cost too much if you're buying them from a foreign country. And at a time when the Polish shipyards, the newly created nations, are building their own ships. So, you know, there's a huge problem for British industry because of what happens in the 1920s. But it's much more convenient for the ruling class to point to these lost generation. And of course, there's enough truth in it, isn't there? You know, if there was no graveyards full of the honourable this and the honourable that, you might have trouble making the point. But it's like, yes, they died, but that's got nothing to do with the economic decline of Britain after the war. And if you look at the problems that were had, even by 1920-21, the then head of the General Staff, Field Marshal Wilson, is struggling to find the troops needed for the new mandates. You know, Britain takes on the mandate for Palestine, takes on the mandate for other areas, and he's going, but there's no soldiers. And of course there aren't any soldiers because all the soldiers want to go home. You know, and therefore they can't maintain the level they had before. So it takes on more commitments at a time when it's got less money. You know, it'd be a bit like saying, well, I'm struggling to pay my mortgage, but never mind, I'll move into a bigger house. Well, you know, great, gives you loads of, opportunities to send people to be governor of this or governor of that area, but at the same time your industries are collapsing and there's no tax base. So, yeah, lost generation, very, very sad for a huge number of people that so many people died. But the concept of a lost generation being the root of the problem for Britain is a denial of the economic realities and the political policies that were followed.
Thank you. So as we're moving towards the end, I'll just, if you don't mind, we look wider into the topic of military history as someone with multiple decades of study in the area, and given the reputation military history has for being less serious than economic or social history, what advice would you give to someone looking to get started in the field, and do you think there are any groups particularly underrepresented in terms of being military historians?
I think it's difficult for any generation, but what I think is perhaps the thing that people will need to do now is to learn some of the lessons from the past, and people are beginning to. But I think there would be a huge amount of opportunity for someone to research particular communities. If they come from a particular community, they can use that to get in underneath the skin of some of those communities and where they contributed. But I think the other thing is that when the First World War veterans were dying off, Lynn MacDonald led the way in saying, hang on, before they die, let's interview the rest that remain. And I think the oral history has begun to be quite a strong feel. But I think people also need to recognise time moves on. There's always a tendency, I think, with, you know, there's no disrespect to the BBC or other companies, but it tends to be a sort of, you know, oh well, let's show pictures of the Somme again, let's show pictures of the Flanders fields or a Second World War cemetery, because they're the big ones, they're easy to do. And I'm not for a minute suggesting it'd be easy to do anything to do with Northern Ireland, but maybe we need to start seeing people looking at Korea. I know a Korean War veteran who's now 96. You know, it's getting to the point where there won't be any of those left. So we need to have a look at that. And I think also we need to look at some of the other conflicts, Malaya and so on. And you know, let's get some interviews with those who were serving at Aden and other places during the retreat from Empire. So let's have a look at those. Those would be areas I would be going into. As regards whether military history is serious or not, it really depends on how you do it. If you just scrabble together a few stories of guys who, you know, despite the horrible machine gun fire, ran forward and threw grenades into a pillbox, or you focus on you know, somebody who was running you know, in World War II and was doing some other brave act of defiance on the beaches of Omaha or whatever, absolutely fine. But that's not the deeply analytical history that you're looking for on a broader level. So it's how you approach your history, whether it's economic, social, military. Do you go to the primary sources? Do you cross-reference? Do you focus? That's what makes it serious history. You can write some fairly light-hearted economic history if you want, you know, talk about what grandma cooked and so on. I'm involved at the moment with a project for the Tamworth Cooperative Society archives, and some of what we produce from there will not be what you might call serious history, because it will be, you know, what people had, everyday lives, what they're, so on. But you can then also do serious analysis by cross-referencing against sales, against, you know, and talk about the proportion of household income. You know, you can get into some very detailed stuff, or you can keep it on one level. They're both social history. They're both economic and social history, I should say. But it's how you approach it. That's the key. Soldier history can be just as serious and just as carefully documented as the classic medieval historian with their scrolls and rolls, and just as detailed as somebody doing Tudor or Stuart history, looking at the documentation, the publications or whatever. It's as serious as you want it to be, and sometimes we'll steer towards that, sometimes we'll steer towards a more populist level, because what you're trying to do is get people interested and to meet their needs. And if they're researching their ancestors and they know that their ancestors were a coal miner in the town, and this coal miner used to buy, you know, 3 quarts of milk a week and buy their bread from here and spend most of their income on their rent, that's actually what they want to know, and that's fair enough. But then you can write a comparative study and look at a regional changes and impacts and so on. So there's always reasons to do both. History needs to be accessible, needs to be something that's relevant, but you can also apply rigour.
Well, thank you very much for being on the programme, and thank you to dogs Millie and Alfie for not barking during the interview.
And thank you for having me on this show.
Well, thank you again to Dr Simon Peaple for joining us today on the interview, and thank you everyone for watching. It was a lot of very interesting history of the First World War and how it's seen and studied, and hopefully it's helpful to everyone, and well, it was lovely having you here.